Perfect. Thank you, Stacy, for that kind introduction. It's great to be back here, and good morning to all of you. So I'm going to talk about something I'm very passionate about, which is social media. And starting as a skeptic, I actually probably about 6-7 years ago was pretty much a skeptic. I actually didn't believe in it, but I hope to convince some of you actually of why this is important in your careers as researchers, but also as just clinicians and physicians. And part of that is really the importance of knowledge. So, what are we doing with research? Well, really what you're trying to do is to assess what we know, current knowledge, and then what the gaps are and build on that and generate new knowledge. I mean, that's the end goal of research, creating new knowledge, ideally new knowledge that's going to help improve patient care. And as they say, knowledge is power. That really is a critical piece that I think you will want to think about, not only as a researcher, but also as a clinician, because the amount that you have to know nowadays is just exponentially greater than it was 20 years ago. The volume and pace of medical research is increasing. And building that, I think, is something that you really want to think about from the lens of not, I'm going to rely on my fellowship program to teach me, but how am I going to keep up with knowledge over the course of my career, over the next several years in fellowship, after you graduate. And I hope to give you in changing that paradigm from I'm going to sit in a lecture and learn and somebody else is responsible for my learning to me being responsible. This is part of where I think social media can be very helpful. So the objective, as the title said, is really to talk about social media and other online resources to bolster your research and paired with that, your knowledge, because I think these go really hand in hand. All of you will take on scholarly work, but you also are going to become clinicians and rely on knowledge to provide good care to your patients. So this is how you started off in your training. You felt like you didn't know anything. Everything was new. Probably think back to those days, maybe when you were just starting off in medical school. Not too long ago, you were an intern, writing Tylenol orders and feeling like I kind of am getting the hang of things. And very recently, you were residents, and I think you started to build on these foundation, the blocks, and now you're going to all, in your roles as fellows here, are going to become specialists. And I think that's a very unique opportunity that you have to really refine and become specialized in a particular area, in a particular field of what you're doing your training in. But one of the exciting things about being in an academic center is some of you will have the opportunity to really be experts in what you do, in a particular aspect of what you do to be an expert. And I think that is, don't lose sight of that. And when you are rounding with your attendings, you're at an amazing institution, lots of expertise around. That's actually one of the valuable things about being here is people who have unique expertise in particular conditions, in particular populations. And some of you may decide to say, I really like academia. I see myself wanting to be an expert. And the key to that then is, as an expert, knowledge is critical. Generating new knowledge, being the purveyor of kind of the most up-to-date knowledge, because people are going to look to you as the expert to be the source of this information. And you will then have to hold on yourself that burden of really keeping up to date. And I think that's critical and one of the things that differentiates experts from others. So one of the challenges is minding the gap. And I think they kind of have the confidence curves where you start off in training, you get really confident your first few months because you're getting the hang of things. And not until really over the course of years, you really actually lose some of that confidence because you realize how much you don't know about things. And that's an important piece of learning. And so thinking about minding the gap, and I think rounds are a great way. As a clinical researcher, a lot of the questions that I think of started with discussions we had at rounds with some of my colleagues and saying, I wonder why this is, or is that really true? Or why do we do things this way? And so take advantage of that as you're starting in your first 2 months about the uncertainties of decisions you make, how you treat patients. Maybe on call you made a decision, you said, was that the right thing or not to do? And one of the great opportunities you have is you'll get to work with lots of different attendings. And one of the things you might notice is practice variation of one person does things one way, another does things. I wonder what's the data behind it? What's the questions that emerge from that? And an area I study a lot is NEC. I still remember as a first-year fellow, the first baby I had, this was at Emory Midtown that developed NEC. And one of the things I got really worried about, because after, you play Monday morning quarterback, did this baby get NEC because I started feeds too fast? I was just feeding this baby too fast, and that's why the baby got NEC. Ended up needing surgery, lost some bowel. You feel really uncertain and take advantage of that knowledge gap. So, asked around to 3 of my attendings at the time, get different answers. One said, well, I don't think it matters. I'm okay with however you want to feed the baby. Another colleague, Dr. Bug, some of you worked with him, I like to feed slowly because I worry about NEC. Then you have some attendings who work in the lab and bring a different perspective. So Dr. Carlton, our division, she said, it might work with fetal lambs and bringing into the preclinical perspective. You get a lot of these different perspectives. But you also get some very humble perspectives. And one of the ones that I got from my attending at the time, this was Ann Kreitz, who had been one of the neonatologists that helped start one of our units, said, I've been doing this for 40 years. I am confident I don't know what to do when it comes to feeding babies. That should be really a big opportunity to say, this is something that is an uncertainty that we haven't answered. So a knowledge gap that I think we need to solve. And you can pair that with just becoming used to not just taking kind of what the discussions you have, but actually going to literature and trying to go to the top of that pyramid and say, well, what's out there? What can I learn from it that's out there? And the kind of habit of using tools to build on knowledge incrementally. And one of the sources I often use is the Cochrane Review. Very simple. You're on call. I remember doing this about feeding. I always have a habit of, whenever I start with looking to see if there's a Cochrane Review, because somebody's done the hardest work for you of searching the world's literature and synthesizing it for you. So I said, okay, feeding rate, preterm infant, Cochrane, what do I get? And this is a recent version of that same review. And here's the data. And the data said, actually, that it's not so clear that actually slowly feeding a baby has any benefit in reducing NEC. And actually, if you slowly feed a baby, you might slightly increase the risk of an invasive infection. So there might actually be trade-offs. And so this is a good habit, I think, of taking advantage as you're rounding, when you're on call, of getting in the habit of doing this, of not only taking what you learn, but actually questioning it and looking it up and building on it. And this habit stemmed from me when I was an intern. We had a tradition in our residency program where every night on the Gen Ped service, the third year had to pull up a study related to that admission that was relevant for the care, a decision made, whether you decide to put that baby with bronchiolitis on a pulse ox, you had to pull up a study and talk about it. And it really ingrained this idea of evidence-based medicine. And I hope some of you might be already doing this, but I hope you take that as a strategy to try to build into because you're going to be busy. Your time is going to be constrained over the course of your career. And so if you don't find a way to do this as just a regular part of everything you do, just like writing orders, just like writing a progress note, it will be hard to say, I'm just going to wait and do it when I have a downtime that won't ever come. So how do you do it more systematically? And this is where some of those tools I talked about is. This is kind of on an individual patient basis, trying to build knowledge relevant to the patients you care for. That's critical not only to care for patients, but also to identify gaps that you all will then go and try to address with research and scholarly work that you do. And so one of the things I think is really useful and a good part of your first year as a fellow is to try to take advantage of the time in the unit, the time in your clinics where you think about what excites you and what sparks your interests. Because you will spend a lot of hours on a research project. Potentially, that might be the start of what you spend your career on in an area of research. And I think passion is critical if you can find it. Sometimes it's not so clear and you try a few things and eventually you develop kind of an area you want to work on. But think about what sparks your interest in an area. And if you're thinking about a research project, one of the key things you want to do is to really think about what is an unanswered question. And this is harder than it seems. And I find this actually to be much more challenging than I thought it would be. And if you go to scientific meetings, I go to PIS meeting and I see so many posters of people that I said, this is already an answered question. Why are we asking this question again and again and again? It's been shown in large clinical trials and large studies, and what's the benefit of a single center study showing the same phenomenon? A lot of effort went into that. Maybe a lot of learning went into that, but it didn't generate new knowledge that's going to help patients. And so being attuned to kind of knowledge gaps, and the key for that is to build your knowledge. You're going to have the benefit of mentors, experts that you're going to work with, but on your own, you want to build the knowledge to make sure you're really addressing knowledge gaps. And one of the tools you can use is a systematic review. This might be a nice project as a first year if you're interested in an area of research. Search the world's literature, synthesize, and see what's out there to make sure that what you're doing is new, original. And it might also be not something you have to write up and publish, but at least ensuring that you've thoroughly gone through the literature and kind of get a good sense of the basis. So this is something that Emory helps you with if this is of interest. So this is from the Woodruff Health Sciences Library. This is actually just from, I just pulled this yesterday. So tomorrow, there's actually 9 seats left for planning for a systematic review classroom that's given by the librarians that gives you search data on search strategies, what databases to use, having you be able to kind of effectively search the literature. Now, a full-on systematic review can be a big lift. It can take you over a year. So not something to be done lightly, but this is one tool that might be helpful for you to get a good grasp on knowledge, and particularly if you're working in a very unique niche area where there may not be a lot of information, that this might be the first time that somebody's actually gone through the trouble of searching the world's literature to try to say what's out there on this specific condition, on this specific intervention. That can be innovative, that can be a nice start, that doesn't require any data collection, just requires any new kind of patient-related data collection, just requires looking at the existing literature. The other thing that you are going to be working on, if you haven't already, is to try to find a mentor. And I would take really a lot of effort in trying to get to know your mentors or potential mentors you're interested in working with. They're going to be critical, I think, to your success. I have been really, really fortunate over the course of my career to have wonderful mentors who really were invested in what I did. But one of the things you really want to know is, in addition to a lot of the dynamics of kind of mentor-mentee fit, is getting to know the work they do, especially if you're thinking about spending what might be 2-3 years working with a mentor. So I'm going to give you some strategies on how you can do this. The traditional way of doing this is you can meet with their lab group members, maybe another fellow who's trained with them. You can ask for their CV. I think you shouldn't be afraid to ask for a CV or biosketch. That's their tool that they've spent a lot of time thinking about the areas that they've worked on and contribute to in the field. Worth reading that and seeing what they've done. You can do a PubMed search of their name and look at their work. You can go to pedsresearch.org, and a lot of the research faculty have profiles there. But there's 2 additional tools that you may not be familiar with. The first is researchgate.net, which is essentially social media for researchers. And the second is Google Scholar. I think both of these tools can be helpful for you to get to know maybe not even just your potential mentors, but maybe just some of the attendings you work with, because you're curious and interested in knowing what they do in your division and what they're working on and what's their areas of research. So this is Andy Shane, who's our chief of pediatric ID that many of you know. And so this is her profile from ResearchGate. And you can see a few things. You can actually look. This is something she just published very recently. But you can actually look, and it will actually have all the articles that she's published. And you can go through and look at a summary of all the papers that she's done. They might even have conference papers. And there's even areas that some people have options of putting and listing active projects. So projects and areas that they're working on. Lots of our faculty, this is dependent on people setting up the profile. So not every person in pediatrics will have one, but this is a good tool to try to get a quick snapshot of what a potential faculty member is working on. And you can even look, if you were interested, you can even look at the department, and you can see there's been over 7,000 publications, 25,000 authors that are affiliated with Emory Department of Pediatrics. And you can look and actually peruse the contributions if you're curious to see what's going on, because this is a big place. Lots of researchers, lots of things going on. It is sometimes very hard to keep up with all the things that are going on. It's easy to get siloed. I feel like as neonatologists, we're kind of sometimes stuck away at 2 of our sites and don't often get a chance to interact with a lot of the people that are based here. And so this is a nice way to get a feel for what's going on. The other is Google Scholar. And Google Scholar, I think, has become a very powerful tool where, again, not everybody will have this, but this is a way that researchers can create their own profiles. This is from Dr. Matt Oster, who's one of the cardiologists here, who's been very successful as a researcher. And you can actually click follow. You can actually follow him. And what Google does is when you click follow, it will actually, when he publishes something new, it will give you an alert to say, this is a new publication by Matt Oster. And it is a way to get a sense of what somebody's working on and what they're doing. And maybe a study that you should know if you're a cardiologist and there's a very relevant publication that probably it's good to know what people in your own group are doing that you might not know. It also gives you an idea of some of the kind of key research that has been done. You can sort it by year, look at things that have been done more recently. Matt's done a lot of work on MISC in children as COVID has come on, and he's been done a lot of work with CDC. So this is another tool, I think, that it can be very useful. You can follow as many people as you want, and this is a great way to get to know people's work. The third is something called Expertscape. So Expertscape is relatively new. It's objective in that it's purely algorithmic based. And it uses an algorithm. It's not, clear exactly what the weights of all the measures are, but the tool, it started out as a way to find an expert on a particular problem. But you can do this and try to find expertise in your area of research. If you're looking at acute myeloblastic leukemia as your area of research, who are the experts that do that? Or if you're interested in type 1 diabetes, or if you're interested in, for what I do, which is, my primary area of research is necrotizing colitis, who are the experts that are working in that area? This is really important because you really do want to know, not just at your own institution, but who are the people interested in. Because you don't want to have that missed opportunity if you're at PAS and you see somebody come up to you and ask you a question at your poster and you don't recognize their name and missed that opportunity to realize that's actually one of the world's leading experts in that area that you do. That could have been an opportunity to meet them and have a conversation. And so take advantage of this tool. It has a fairly large number of conditions. So this is necrotizing colitis. It'll look at kind of all the articles published with this keyword using PubMed since 2011. And then you can actually look and see who is the kind of top expert or experts in the field. And you can actually search and click on them and say, okay, what are they working on? These people who have been searching on, this is Joe New, well-known in the field. Clearly, I think I've played around with this, and I actually do think this holds up for a lot of neonatal conditions. So I think there is some face validity to this tool, even though it's relatively new. So they've looked at about 10,000 authors, and so he's in the very, very, very high percentile of NEC. And then you can actually look and see what have they been working on recently. That gives you a little bit of a sense of what, generally the people who are at the top of this list are probably the people who are going to get, they have large labs, they can move very nimbly, they probably are going to be working in areas that are at the leading edge, often, not always. It depends on where they are in their career. But you can kind of get a sense of what he's doing. So in 2021, really working on machine learning to differentiate NEC and spontaneous intestinal perforation. Big challenge in our field, big issue. I would say one of the areas that's critical. So it gives you a sense of what somebody else is doing. It also gives you an idea of maybe some recent reviews that might be a useful tool to search from. People who are experts who've been doing this for a long time. Sometimes they can bring a very broad breadth of expertise and perspectives to what they do. Not always, but I would say this can be a useful tool. All right. So the other challenge is, how do you keep up your knowledge up to date with all the other things that are going on in your life? Because you're going to be busy. You're already busy. You're going to be busy for the rest of your lives. Time is going to be the most valuable resource that you have in your career. And so how do you keep up with knowledge? This is a challenge. This is really tough with all the other things that are important to you that you have to do, all the demands on your time, clinical responsibilities. And I think this is where efficiency matters, and thinking a lot about how to be efficient. And I'm going to make a big argument of why I think Twitter is a very efficient way to keep up with knowledge. Some of you might be on it and maybe using it in a particular way. And then there's other ways in which you don't have to go to search for the knowledge, like I showed you with the PubMed search, but it actually comes into your mailbox. So journal alerts is one of the ways that you can do that. And then using data curators that do the same thing. They do the searching, and you get the information to you. And I think these can all be tools. Some you may like more than others. Some you might try out and say, this isn't really for me, or I don't find it useful. But we'll go through each of these. I'm going to start with Twitter. Twitter's really, I think, you have to kind of box out the Twitter that comes with politics and really think about kind of, I think that as a different world, and think of it, what's kind of been termed med Twitter, as a tool for clinicians and physicians and researchers to have conversations online that really do span boundaries, in my experience, from people all around the world that you might not typically get to interact with. But Twitter can also be a powerful tool to curate. And I think this I have found today, about 90+% of the new literature and research important to me, I find on Twitter before any other source. You get the benefit of crowdsourcing of key findings that just get sourced by amplification through things like retweets or likes. And there's a pretty broad community of people, especially in our field, dedicated to evidence-based medicine that do the legwork of, and I'll share some of the examples of that. And this might be an opportunity for, if there's not somebody like that in your field, to take that on as a group of fellows, potentially allowing the work that we do here and the work that you do as fellows can be really important in dissemination of evidence. So I was, as I said, a skeptic. I joined in 2015, and I joined after actually going across the street. School of Medicine has these faculty development seminars, so I used to go to them, and I went to one of them, and they were making a case for social media use for physicians. And I was pretty skeptical, but I said, okay, let me try. And so they told me, and I'll give you some kind of rules, but it said, start your profile, keep it separate from what you use for personal use, have a completely separate professional profile, and give yourself a few months, because it'll be hard to get kind of used to get a feel for things. You might not be following the right content or know how to kind of access it or build the network where what's coming into your feed is critical. So give it some time to kind of to get a good feel for it. And it took about 6 months. I actually wasn't really sure if this was going to be useful or not. It took a while, but I stuck around with it, and over time I found this to be really helpful. One of the ways it's been helpful is groups that do curation. So in our field, we have the International Society for Evidence-Based Neonatology. I just took on the role of chair, but this is an international group that started out of Karolinska in Sweden. And their goal is to ensure the most rapid translation of evidence into practice. And one of the biggest challenges, I think, is there's just too much evidence and too little time for all of us to keep up with all of it. And then you have the evidence, but you have to read it, you have to know what it means, you have to put it into context. And this is a really big challenge. So this group spends a lot of effort on working on curation of evidence, appraisal of reviews, and we have partnerships with journals that do that, surveying what the practices are, because what might be considered standard of care here might be completely out of the bounds somewhere else in the world, and vice versa. And it's a good tool. And so what they do, and this is an example, is they have a group of social media editors, 12 of them around the world, that go through all the neonatal journals every month, and they pull relevant articles. And these articles are then summarized in these infographics to kind of give high-level, quick views. This is one actually published recently from Liz Sewell, one of our faculty, looking at seizure treatment in newborns and confirming that actually levetiracetam might not be the best first-line treatment for neonatal seizures. So other groups have similar things in other parts of medicine, but this is a good way where you're just getting through your feed as you're scrolling snippets of this. And you don't have to remember every single detail of the study, but you might remember, hey, there's this new study, it's comparing treatment medications for seizures. That's really relevant when I have the next neonate with seizures and I'm trying to decide between two commonly used first-line drugs. I should know this study, not only for my research purposes, but just as good knowledge. And I should probably know it not in the next 3 years. I should probably know it relatively recently because this plus another trial are both really relevant. There's also a good way to get some sense and ask questions and interact and questions that are really relevant. Should we be starting nitric oxide on babies who are, you might see them in the PICU, 6 months old, severe BPD, they have chronic pulmonary hypertension. Is this something we should do? This might give you an inkling of maybe this is an opportunity for a research question because there's not that much data out there. And some interesting questions that happen. And it gives you a snapshot also of what practices are, where there's practice variation, which may suggest this is a comparative effectiveness question because there's really a lot of variation in the way people do things that you lose if you're just at an institution where there might be a protocol, a standard way of doing things. You lose the broader perspective of the way things are done. You also can follow journals, and journals like JAMA Pediatrics they do nice infographics where they'll share you trials. If you're a chronology fellow, you probably want to know about this trial in type 1 diabetes. Quick way to get access to this kind of information across your feed. And it has broad reach. And we worked through EB-NEO in terms of just having ways and structures in which we can create communities around evidence. One of the ways is through the use of hashtags. And so as a group at our kind of annual PAS meeting, we worked on developing something called neonatal evidence-based medicine as a hashtag so that people can tag anything that's relevant to neonatal evidence-based medicine. They use this hashtag. Started with a group of us, and now it's gotten picked up by most of a lot of the journals in our field that use this to tag content and conferences. And one of the things is it gets a big reach. And so it's one way you can just type this in the search of Twitter or another program, and you can quickly see everything that's linked to neonatal evidence-based medicine. If you want to be really efficient in searching what's relevant to what you do in your field, it's probably the same. There might be similar hashtags for what you do with infectious disease or other areas. And this is something that also allows you, when you're generating content and want to share things broadly, to realize that there's a pretty broad reach of people that are interested in this kind of work. And there's ways and tools you can use to track that. And so what we're seeing here is just with this hashtag, which is just in our own field, about 500 to 1,000 tweets a month, and about 25,000 tweets that have happened that have used this hashtag. So lots of knowledge contained in those snippets that are being produced by not just people locally in the US, but really around the world. And you get to have some interesting conversations that challenge conventional thinking. And I think this is really important because sometimes we get so used to just, this is the protocol we use, this is the guideline we use, this is the way we do things here at Emory and Children's, that you don't get a chance to step back and really question. And one of the things, this is just one thing that I remember looking at, is if you have a hemoglobin A1C of 6.6%, you have diabetes. You can get treated, it's bad, but if it's 6.4%, you don't have diabetes. Is there something magical about this inflection point right here? Same question I ask with neonatology colleagues. If you have prolonged rupture of membranes for 19 hours, why is that completely different than 17 hours? 19 hours, you get antibiotics, you get sepsis workup, 17 hours, you're okay. It's actually pretty silly when you look at one of the cardinal rules as a statistician is dichotomizing a continuous variable, because the risk of complications, and this is looking at a variety of complications of type 2 diabetes, it's really continuous. It just goes up over time and creates these false thresholds we have. This is Frank Harrell, one of the world's leading biostatisticians, who's on Twitter. He's at Vanderbilt, to highlight this challenge. And we realized this, we look back now and think how silly it was that the CDC and what we were doing was to treat newborns using these cut points that probably didn't account for risk well. Now we have very much better, more precise online risk-based estimators that you just enter the continuous hours of rupture membranes, avoiding this. And I think this kind of exposure can be helpful. I find this useful and interesting. And there's lots of this that's happening on Twitter that I think can stimulate your thinking, challenge current paradigms And also keep up with broad things that are happening outside of your field in medicine. This is one from one of my friends who's in Saudi Arabia, who published this thing that I would have never come across, that looked at actually what should you think about when assessing a clinical guideline recommendation for your population. Very practical information that I probably wouldn't have come across for a while, but saw it, they pulled it, and really a lot of good things about thinking. If you see a practice guideline from the IDSA, from the American Academy of Pediatrics, what should you think about before applying it into your practice? It also allows an opportunity to share your own research. And I think this is important because you have to remember that most people, despite your best efforts, will probably never see your research findings. Because if you look at the data and the statistics, it varies, but out of 100 clinicians, maybe one will actually go past the abstract in terms of reviewing a paper. Most will stop at the title, some will read the abstract. Why we focus so much on making sure your abstract is very precise when you're writing. So you want to share it, and you want to provide context and maybe even broader and more subjective things than what's allowed in a journal. And you get an opportunity to write it in your own style, in your own context, and share your research broadly with people. And it does generate, you do get exposure to this. This shouldn't be the only reason you're on Twitter, but this is one of the tools to share the work that you're doing broadly with people who care about it. And as this community grows, which we've seen grow in a long time, when we started EBNEO, it was about 1,000 people that were involved. Now it's about 10,000 people that follow EBNEO. And I think this community is continuing to grow. So some guidance in terms of getting started if you're not already on Twitter, or to some kind of guidance if you are, is have a separate personal account and a professional account. Just keep them separate. Make sure you're clear that you're not speaking on behalf of Emory. Some people say tweets equal my own or something like that to say you're really speaking for yourself. You can start following others and just observe for a while. Give yourself some time to kind of get a feel for it. Don't post any identifiable information. Even if you don't have a date on the photo, just the date you posted can be considered identifiable. So avoid posting patient data, photographs, or any other identifiable information. There's variable guidance about waiting about a year from when you take a photo before you should post it publicly, so you can't get a sense of what was on the photo linked to a patient. Be courteous, respectful. Social media can have the downside, and you want to make sure that you're considerate in what you post. And use hashtags like I showed you for NeoEBM for searching content. Then, for some of you, this might just be enough as a way to peruse and look. For some of you, you might decide to share content and start posting. Emory has guidelines for this, useful to kind of read about their guidance and rules around this, and follow that as you take this on. And then start to follow people. And you can start locally. You can follow, my boss's boss, John Lewin. He's the head of Woodruff Health Sciences Center, our Department of Pediatrics, to get a sense of what's going on here locally. Lots of exciting things happening in our department that it's hard to keep up with. This might be one way to get a sense of what's happening, or even what's happening within kind of the research alliances that surround us. You can follow Tom. He's on Twitter, and tweeted about a bacteria that I thought was really fascinating. That was out of some candles, scented oil, something like that, that caused babies to be sick. So follow colleagues here in the department. You can also follow journals. Most of the journals in our field now have Twitter accounts, and they allow you to follow and bring the content to you. And then there's the American Academy of Pediatrics also has a lot of what they call tweetiatricians, which are pediatricians that are on Twitter. Emory Medicine has lists of doctors and students that are part of these groups. And this is actually important for advocacy efforts. And a lot of what American Academy of Pediatrics wants is advocacy. And this is really a key tool for advocacy. And if you ever, some of their national seminars, they'll highlight this. Mark Del Monte, who's the CEO, has always made a case to convince people to join Twitter when he's coming to meetings. So I hope that gives you at least some of the benefits of using Twitter. So we're going to kind of finish up talking about some of the other ways to be efficient. Nobody's sitting at the fireplace reading the ever increasing list of journals. The stack just gets too long, probably losing a lot of trees in the process. So sign up for electronic table of contents, and you can quickly peruse them. They come into your inbox, and you can see what's important. These are probably some of the ones you should sign up for, and then there's probably others that are relevant to your subspecialty. And you can even pick specific content. So for JAMA Network, for example, their journals, you can highlight what's relevant for pediatrics. This is an example from the Google Scholar blog about why you really want to think about following research for key authors, is that really if you're an early stage researcher or grad student, following your advisor or few key faculty members will allow you to see research landscape from their experience vantage point and the way they use the algorithms. So another plug for kind of following people on Google Scholar. You can also create alerts on Google Scholar. And these alerts can be helpful if you have a specific area of interest. I study necrotizing enterocolitis, so I want to know anytime there's any study anywhere in the world that has necrotizing enterocolitis in the title. Sends it to my inbox once a week. Other keywords might be useful in other areas that you're working on. Very useful for stuff to come to you instead of you having to go search for it. Takes just one time to set it up, and you're going to get that in your inbox. And Google does some pretty cool things in terms of actually, and I don't know exactly how they do that, but they actually will suggest and recommend articles for you based on, I think, who you follow and what you publish. They're actually pretty relevant. They do a good job. And so this is one way that Google will pull articles that I think are relevant. And I've been surprised at how accurate it is in terms of finding articles that I think are useful. Mendeley.com is another tool. I used to use this, and I've not used this as much anymore, but this can be useful for, again, kind of using curation, and it can suggest articles for you. And the way it does that, you can also have a library that can store publications and documents, and I can actually save the PDFs here and have the citations, so you can actually easily search through a variety of PDFs in this tool to find keywords and language, saying, I remember this study had something, I can't remember which paper it was. You can try to type it and it'll scan through this PDFs and try to find it. So Mendeley can be useful as a kind of citation manager and a publication manager as a tool that's available, and it's online. There's organizational curators. Our field has the American Academy of Pediatrics section on neonatal perinatal medicine. There's a lot of their own curation. Every month, a group of neonatologists will go through all the relevant publications and select them. So this can be a good way to quickly peruse what's there. It's a very, very broad list, so sometimes not as specific to what you want to do, but gives you an idea of what's important in your field, and they'll write quick snippets for key trials or studies that have been published. And I think really exciting is kind of the evolution of digital learning and tools. And one thing that's been just published this year, started this year, actually by 2 private practice neonatologists out in Florida, is podcasts. So this is a weekly podcast. Every week they go through the neonatal literature and talk about 5 or 6 of the key studies. And they interview researchers, talk about the stories behind the research, because there's this labor of love that sometimes you don't get to hear about that are involved. We just finished a trial this year that started in the late 1990s in conception. Took about 20 years. That's a massive amount of effort that you know people don't realize when they just look at the articles. Some of the things that behind the scenes to give you perspectives. And they also interview families that have started foundations. So really cool. There are probably podcasts like that in your field. I know some of the PICU docs have some cool podcasts, so a good opportunity to learn. And then Amadeo is another organizational curator, amadeo.com, and this allows you to pick topics. You can click journals, and this will pull citations into your inbox. So this is another tool. I started with this, and now I've kind of transitioned to Google Scholar, so I don't use this as much because Google Scholar is so good. But this is another tool that might be a way to curate what's relevant to you, area of research, subspecialty you're in, and this is free. It's supported by, I think, one of the pharma companies, although it's independent of that as a foundation grant. And so they also, if you're interested in COVID, they curate kind of the top 10 COVID papers every day. And then SmartBrief, you can sign up for these. Pediatrics has one, the American Academy of Pediatrics, that gives you kind of the top stories that come into your inbox as a quick read of a few things. Probably not the depth you need for most of keeping up. This is fairly superficial, but a tool. And then the final thing I would say is schedule some time to review and spend time keeping up with the literature. This is the challenge. I think if you don't put the priority, if this isn't an important priority, just like other things are, then it's not going to be a priority, and it's going to be hard to keep up with that. And so just like you have to go into service, you have your clinic hours, just as important should be keeping up with the evidence and build that into what you do. If you can make it efficient, even if it's just an hour a week. Even if it's, I'm going to listen to that podcast when I'm on the bike. That's what I do. When I am at the Y, I listen to the Incubator podcast. Good way to catch up, kill two birds with one stone. I'm doing that. Even if you figure out ways to integrate that, think of how you're going to ingrain this as part of your daily work, as part of your role as a physician, as a specialist in what you do. If you start now, I think it'll become easier as you get busier, as more things get added to your plate over the course of your careers, in terms of still having this, because this, I think, is a shortcoming of just, and a challenge we have nowadays, particularly in the era of guidelines, which somebody else is doing the hard work of keeping up with the literature and just translating it for you on a piece of paper, and you just know that this is the guideline. Well, why do you do it? Well, this is our guideline, but why? And I think knowing the evidence is important, and you might be the person that then gets asked to do the guideline and keeping up with the literature. So I hope that gives you a useful snapshot, and that you are better equipped to use these tools and social media to not only bolster your research, but also I think your knowledge, which I think will help in the end benefit patients, benefit others, and so thank you for listening. And I'm happy to take any. I think we have a few minutes if there's questions that you have. Sure. Yeah.
So I'm interested that you sort of mentioned Mendeley, but don't use it anymore. You mentioned that it is a citation manager. Emory supports OneNote, but not Mendeley. So my question to you is, first, it's not exactly what you're talking about. Which citation manager do you use and why?
Yeah, I use EndNote, partly because it's just most commonly used. And so if I'm sharing it with other researchers and I'm working collaboratively on a review article, it just is easier to use. I think the challenge is EndNote is just good for citations. And I think it's problematic for a way to store your PDFs and to keep a repository of all the articles organized and to be able to search it effectively. And I think Mendeley is good for that. The nice thing is Mendeley, you can actually upload fairly easily a paper. You can upload your papers in and it pulls it in. But I don't use it for citations. So I just use it as kind of a repository to hold PDFs of studies, and then use EndNote. And I know there's other products that are out there that people swear by. And I think some of that is, if you use Google Scholar, if you use Google Docs, there's plugins that are very effective for citation, but only useful for Google Docs. So that's my kind of bias, but I think everybody hates citation software, all clunky. And so.